administration. She's interviewed by former New York Observer editor-in-chief Elizabeth Spiers. Afterwards is a weekly interview program with relevant guest hosts interviewing top nonfiction authors about their latest work.
Hi, I'm here with Vicky Ward, the author of Kushner, Inc., a book about Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. It's great to have you here today. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about two people that I knew a little bit, but not nearly as intimately as I did after I finished your book. So I guess to start off with, what made you want to write this book?
So, you know, Elizabeth, as I think you know, I have, my beat has always been sort of the world of money, the intersection of money, power, and the culture. And I was familiar with the culture that both the Kushners and the Trumps came from, because the book before this was about the world of New York real estate. And, I had known Donald Trump over 10 years. I had known Jared Kushner socially a little bit. I actually met him when he very first came to New York and bought the New York Observer, where you would end up working. But what I was really curious to see, sort of having understood the very ruthless, kind of unregulated world of real estate, was whether they would take that with them to Washington, or whether that Washington would change them. And I think that, at the beginning of the administration, there was all this hope riding on Jared and Ivanka that they would be this sort of moral center, these moderating influences on President Trump. But I think that I saw signs very early on that perhaps they hadn't really gone into Washington for public service. They'd really gone for self-service. This was a family real estate business now running the White House. And you saw that first week of the transition when Ivanka, the whole Trump family gathered for the 60 Minutes interview, and then, her fashion line put out the next day that people could buy her diamond bracelet for over $10,000. And although she apologized, as someone very senior in the transitions said to me later, but you can't unsee it. Yeah. And as we know, when she did go into the White House for 18 months, she would not let go of that fashion line. This is a clear conflict of interest, and people like Gary Cohn, Rex Tillerson really had to sell everything. But it was sort of seemed to be one rule for Jared and Ivanka and a whole different set of rules for everyone else. And I think I also saw the signs with Jared right before the inauguration, when the New York Times broke the story that he had, the first weekend of the transition, been meeting with his father, with a major Chinese insurance company. His chairman is now in jail for life. But this was a meeting to try to solve this financial albatross that Jared Kushner had hanging around his shoulders when he went into the transition and into the government. And within the same sort of few weeks in the transition, he's also hosting the Chinese government in his transition capacity at Kushner Company's headquarters. I mean, these are the kinds of conflicts that we've never seen before. And it was this idea, this sort of this theme that Jared and Ivanka are not who we hope they be. They're not what they seem. They are people who have grown up, are trained to think that rules are for other people. And above all, the fact that Jared goes into the government with this enormous financial problem, that he and his father, and this is, I think on another level, this is a story of two children who really are still children, who are so identified in each of their cases and controlled by their fathers and their fathers' financial needs. So all of that, I mean, there are many threads. I often think of this in a way as 6 books in one, because we move from New Jersey to New York to Washington, but then to the rest of the world as Jared is out looking for ways for foreign investors to solve his financial problems. So all of these threads are why I wrote it.
So you knew them slightly in New York. When you heard people saying, they're going to go to Washington and moderate Trump, what was your initial impression? What were your expectations when they went to D.C.?
Well, so I was skeptical because I had known them slightly. I didn't know it. I was part of a 3-point plan that a New York PR guru, very famous in his heyday, Howard Rubenstein, came up with for Charles Kushner when he went to jail back in 2005. Howard Rubenstein came up with a 3-point plan for the Kushners to rehabilitate the family name. The first part of that was to sell up out of New Jersey and to buy a trophy building in New York. The second was to have Jared own a media outlet which would not only help control the press but introduce him to people. I guess I was one of the people. I was working for Vanity Fair. And the third point was to have Jared date someone prominent. So, we know how that story ended. So I had met him when he was fresh to New York, and actually he'd seemed perfectly charming. Fast forward to the summer of 2016. Jared by then was emerging as a real leader in the Trump campaign. I was working for Esquire magazine, and we were actually brainstorming as to sort of how revamp the magazine. And I came up with the idea of Jared Kushner and his younger brother Josh Kushner, a venture capitalist, actually as a sort of possible cover story. We had no idea that there would be, anything sort of particularly negative. What was interesting about them was that they were the right age for Esquire readers, sort of 30s. And because Jared was, there obviously with the Republican nominee for president, and Josh was well known to be a Democrat, that was actually what seemed at that point to be the most interesting hook. But because of my background and my Rolodex in the world of New York real estate, it took me less than a day to make some calls on Jared's reputation in his own space. And the reporting on that really surprised me, because that reporting showed that he's so controlled and calm. That's his public image, and he and Ivanka work so hard on their public image. But underneath that, I heard stories of a real fury that sounded very similar to his father's temper, which is notorious. He could be extraordinarily vindictive and very inappropriate. There was a story I told in that piece, basically how he interfered in the real estate dealings of WPP, a huge advertising conglomerate. At the time, Jared was friends with its CEO, Sir Martin Sorrell. That has always been Jared's sort of strength, if you like, his relationships with powerful people. And he had suggested to Martin Sorrell that he didn't think WPP was using its real estate in the most economic way. However, the WP real estate team had already made presentations to their own board with what they wanted to do with certain spaces. So they went ahead and did the deal that they thought made economic sense. Jared read about it. He was so furious that he demanded to come in to WPP, and in front of a whole group of people, he reamed the head of real estate and said, you should just be fired. And this was sort of like, people were just amazed. Who is this person? He doesn't work here. He's a 30-year-old sort of guy working for his dad. And here he is throwing his weight around. And obviously, this, the importance of the story is the fact that this is not a story I think Jared assumed would ever see the light of day, because the head of real estate at WPP is not a powerful name. He's not Rupert Murdoch. He's not, So it's the sort of belittling of people who can't fight back, who are no match for his money. I thought that was really striking. And the other story that I tell in Esquire that I think was really striking, something you were involved in, the Richard Mack story, because it shows the vindictiveness of Jared, really remarkable. Richard Mack was a fellow real estate heir, older than Jared, but they had known each other a little bit socially. Richard Mack and his wife had gone to Jared and Ivanka's wedding, but Richard Mack had a fund, and his fund were lenders on 666 Fifth Avenue. And so when 666 was undergoing a restructuring, this would be back around 2010-11, Jared had phoned Richard Mack and basically asked him for a write-down on the loan, and Richard Mack had said very politely, I can't do that because I have a fiduciary responsibility to my investors. Well, Jared lost it again. This cool, calm veneer comes right off, starts screaming at Richard Mack. Richard Mack thought it was wildly inappropriate because, after all, Jared owed him money. It's like, I think you're forgetting who you're talking to here. But what was then fascinating was Jared's reaction was to come to you, was to come to Dan Geiger, the beat reporter, the real estate beat reporter at the New York Observer. And even after Dan Geiger wrote a memo, spent a week researching, could find nothing on Richard Mack, he writes a memo, says there's nothing here. Jared then phones him and says, there's dirt on this guy, Richard Mack. We've got to get it. Dan Geiger's bewildered. I think, you're extremely concerned that this is not this is not public service, right? At one point, I think I was reached out to. I know I was reached out to, and I wasn't interested because I never heard of Richard Mack at that point. I wasn't going to write a piece about someone I never heard of. So. But that grudge, obviously Jared then took Richard Mack off the, top 100 in his Commercial Observer list. But what was so interesting, in the summer of 2016, he still minded about Richard Mack. And that level of grudge holding, this was all very different from the calm, polished persona that was presented to us.
Yeah, that was, my experience of that incident is that I was also surprised by the extent of the grudge and how obsessed he was with it.
Yeah.
So then after I left, I thought it had gone away, and a real estate reporter who was there told me after the fact that when Ken Kirsten came in, he tried to assign the story again.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes, I'm aware of that. It's really remarkable. And I think that it's very, very, very telling. You have to then look at what happened, what he did to Chris Christie in the transition. And by the way, throwing the transition into absolute chaos, ripping up the work that Chris Christie had been doing for months, and kind of unchecked. And it takes Jared 24 hours to rip up the transition books and fire Chris Christie. And I think that so what I hope my book does is show you the psychology behind that.
Yeah, well, speaking of the psychology, one of the things that you talk about a lot in the book is that if you want to understand Jared or Ivanka, it's important to understand them in the context of who their fathers are.
Yes.
So let's back up a little bit and talk about Jared's father. How would you describe Charlie Kushner and his influence on Jared?
So Charlie Kushner is such a complicated character, right? I think the first thing that you have to remember about the Kushners is that what Charlie's parents went through in the Holocaust, they didn't just survive the Holocaust and Belarus, now Poland. They had to fight, really fight. Charlie's mother, Ray Kushner, gave a very striking interview before she died, talking about how, after her family had been rounded up in a ghetto, they dug a tunnel to escape, And as they were escaping, her brother was shot and killed because his glasses fell off and he couldn't see. And they then found this other group of Jews who were surviving in the bitter cold in the woods. One of those was the man she would marry, Joseph, who took, it was her last name was Kushner. He took her name because she was from the richer, better known family. But even after the war ended, their struggles were not over. I mean, it took them years to finally get over here, where initially they came to Brooklyn, then to New Jersey. Joseph Kushner went into building because no matter how educated you had been, I mean, they couldn't speak the language, you know, you could use your hands. So the Kushners became part of a group of Holocaust survivors in New Jersey called the Builders because they really transformed the state from it's sort of agricultural history to much more sort of suburban, urban enclaves. And Charles Kushner, there's no question, should take enormous credit for building the Jewish community of Livingston in New Jersey. I mean, he created the shul, the mikveh, the synagogue. I mean, you know, he's extraordinarily generous philanthropically, particularly to Jewish causes. The flip side of that is that he would hire for his businesses a lot of the people who worked in the synagogue, the school, the mikveh, and so on. So they felt owned by him. So there's a leverage, there's a price that comes with all of that. And as Charlie Kushner, he was the younger son, he fought very, very hard to be the sort of anointed heir. He wanted to outstrip his older brother, Murray, and be the one to shine in Joseph Kushner's eyes. He was the one who took Joe Kushner's slightly ramshackle construction business and turned it into this development behemoth. I mean, he was lucky. He used a lot of leverage, and the market was with him. But he's the one who really sort of centralized the whole operation. And he did, you know, Joe Kushner, when he died, he left, you know, it's very common in the real estate industry, you divide your assets into different LLCs. So the four Kushner siblings all had these shares in different LLCs. And as Charlie Kushner got richer, his ambitions grew. He clearly had political ambitions. He invited Benjamin Netanyahu to speak in Livingston 4 times. Each visit cost $100,000. Invited many other politicians, mostly Democrats. But he started to bend the rules. And one of the Kushner family explained this mindset to me, that it all stems back to what happened in the Holocaust. Because if Charlie Kushner's parents had done what they were told to, they'd be dead. So now what you're seeing is a mindset that says, we're not going to wait for Jared to see if he gets into Harvard. We're going to make sure he gets into Harvard, so a check's going to get sent. We are, Charlie Kushner, he needed, in order to sort of start wielding real power, he needed to pay, donate to the campaigns of politicians. He wasn't going to wait to ask permission from his siblings to do that. He just took the money. And what happened was that, his brother and certainly one of his sisters didn't like it, and started and sued him. But the civil dispute became public when one of an accountant who worked in Charlie Kushner's offices and was actually giving information to Murray, his older brother, filed an age discrimination suit. That was public. And then the feds, then in New Jersey, the chief prosecutor, U.S. attorney was Chris Christie, saw an opportunity because Charles Kushner was known to be the chief donor and very, very close to Jim McGreevey, the incoming governor. And I think Chris Christie knew that if he investigated Charles Kushner, that would lead to Jim McGreevey. And it did, because Charles Kushner had gone with Jim McGreevey to Israel in 2000. He had been there when Jim McGreevey met a young Israeli called Golan Sipel, with whom Jim McGreevey would have a clandestine homosexual affair. And Charlie Kushner was the one who got Golan Sipel's visa to bring him back to the United States. He was the one who housed Golan Sipel. Jim McGreevey would put this guy on his payroll at an exorbitant salary. He didn't have the right qualifications to be his sort of bodyguard. But while Chris Christie is looking at all these avenues, he is also gathering information about Charles Kushner's personal life. And Charles Kushner's personal life was not something that gelled with where he'd positioned himself at the pinnacle of this very strict Orthodox Jewish community. So Chris Christie had an awful lot of leverage over him because he had information that he could have aired in a public trial that Charlie Kushner and his wife Cheryl would have found tremendously embarrassing. And I think that is why Charles Kushner kind of snaps, and orchestrates this appalling sting, very sordid, awful sting on his brother-in-law, who's cooperating. His sister is cooperating with the feds. He sets up his brother-in-law with a prostitute, films it, and then sends it to his sister. And I think once you understand the leverage and the pressure he felt under, this all sort of begins in a way to make more sense. And then, but of course the sting, the irony is that the sting is what really sends him to jail, because I think, I quote Alan Hammer, a family friend and a lawyer in the book, saying that actually many people think that Charlie Kushner could have beaten the financial charges, but what he did to his brother-in-law, there was no way that a jury were going to say, okay, this is a really good guy after that. And he, once he's charged, he wasn't going to risk going to trial to have his private life exposed, which is why he very uncharacteristically pled guilty so quickly. But I think you have to, all of this is in there, and it's also sorted. But it's in there because I think you have to understand why in Jared's mind and in the other Kushner children's minds, their father did nothing wrong. They don't think that he should have gone to jail. Jared, has said that was a family matter. They don't see this as, they view the system as being the obstacle here. Chris Christie and everything he represented, they were the ones in the wrong. And that is why I think you really have to understand. So you have someone in Jared coming into government who really has a problem with the rule of law and the way it works in this country.
Yeah. I think, my experience with Jared was a lot of that. If we talked about his father at all or his period of incarceration, Jared would maintain that Charlie had done nothing wrong, that he was railroaded by Chris Christie and the media in general. But I always got a little bit of a different response from Josh, and I'm not really sure about the other siblings. How do you think Jared differs from the other siblings, and how much does Charlie's influence have to do with that?
Yeah, so I think there's no question that Jared is by far is the child who was groomed by his father to be his heir, his successor, and the pressure on Jared obviously intensifies and takes on a whole new dimension when Charlie goes to jail, because it's no longer about succeeding his father, who had these ambitions, wanted to be the sort of the Jewish Kennedys. It's now about avenging him, right? It's about rehabilitating the name. It's about righting this wrong that he sees in his mind. I don't think the other children carried the burden in the same way. You've seen Josh Kushner didn't feel the need to go into the family business, even though Charlie kept an office for him. And even more recently, Josh Kushner ended up, going against his parents' wishes and marrying the person he wanted to marry.
I think maybe for useful purposes of comparison, Ivanka also has a relationship with her father that shaped who she is and what her ambitions are. How do you think they're similar and different?
So I think that they're amazingly similar, Jared and Ivanka, but I think it'll be more surprising to readers in a way how controlled Ivanka actually is by her father, because I think a lot of people, certainly in New York real estate, knew for a long time how controlled Jared was by his father. They were very aware, for example, during the restructuring meetings, that Jared would say, I'm just putting my lawyer on speakerphone, and I think everyone in the room knew it wasn't a lawyer, it was Charles Kushner. And they were also aware that it was Charles Kushner was a much better real estate developer than Jared. Unlike Jared, who is not a detail-oriented person, Charles Kushner does know his numbers cold. And I think they knew that all the real decision-making was always being made by Charlie Kushner. Ivanka is a different story, because she has really sort of spun this myth that she's the adult in the room with her father, right, for a very long time, sort of slightly rolling her eyes when he says these inappropriate things. And I think that readers will be more surprised, in a way, to read the scenes that I have when actually Donald Trump makes it very clear that, he's very proud of her and all, but he's in charge. And he's in charge, and he controls her financially, he controls her brand, he controls her identity, he controls her status. I mean, there's one moment in the book where she's freaking out because Kellyanne Conway has gone on television and done something she shouldn't have done. She was, then counseled against, said, go and buy Ivanka's clothing. And Ivanka thinks that this has cast her in a bad light, so she storms in and sort of has a fit about it in front of people to the president. And the president sort of looks at her and says, calm down, honey. You sell shoes. Yeah. I mean, a very, very public put down, right?
Yeah. Well, I think Ivanka and Jared have been very good about controlling their own image. You mentioned in the book that they've cycled through teams of PR people. And Ivanka in particular has what, for lack of a better description, is a personal brand that's kind of become a business conglomerate. They could have stayed in New York when Trump got elected and built their businesses, and she could have continued to build her personal brand. What do you think they thought they were going to accomplish in Washington that would be better than that?
Well, I think so let's one at a time. For Jared, we already knew, anyone in the world of real estate knew he had to find a foreign lender or investor for 666 Fifth Avenue. The clock was ticking. An enormous loan, $1.4 billion, was due in February 2019. And it wasn't even just the debt that was the problem. It was the hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars that would have that the Kushners owed in recapture taxes. And So they, they definitely viewed the campaign as a huge opportunity to court the Chinese, the Qataris, all these people who perhaps wouldn't have been interested in this building. I mean, nobody thought that, a partner of the Kushners in the building said quite publicly, this building would be worth more if it was just dirt. Okay? So I think you have to remember that the Kushners desperately need a foreign investment. And the problem is, of course, we have law. We have the Emoluments Clause to the Constitution that says you cannot receive gifts or bribes from foreign entities. So this was a needle that the Kushners were looking to thread. So there's no question that Jared, goes into this government, and there he is. We see him the first weekend. He's meeting with the Chinese, and during the transition, he's meeting with endless foreigners, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, a team from Saudi, the Russians, and as we know, he doesn't put any of these meetings down on his security clearance forms. Okay, so that's the beginning of that narrative. Ivanka, interestingly, again, her business, once her father became president, all sorts of department stores dropped it. Okay, so she also needed foreign money, foreign customers. She needed foreign trademarks. And so, I think, and this is why, as I say in the book, people in the State Department and senior White House colleagues were sort of horrified that, number one, she didn't actually sell the business when she went into the White House, but that she would put herself on these calls that her father was having with foreign leaders, or in the room. And it wasn't that she necessarily said anything inappropriate on those calls, it was just her presence on them. And everyone noticed, the Chinese premier would arrive, and suddenly Ivanka's brand happened to get loads of trademarks. I mean, it smelled all wrong. And so no matter what she then said, the idea of, I think we would all agree that the expansion of the childcare tax credit that she very much championed, that was a good thing. But it's completely undercut by the fact that at the same time, she had her fashion brand, and it was employing completely appalling labour practices. So her sort of politics felt like lip service and nothing more.
Yeah. It's also that, they've been there for 2 years now, and you can point to the child tax credit as maybe a small win for her.
Right, but it's all about her personal branding.
Sure. And when you look at what they said they were going to do whenever they came in,
right.
Almost nothing's been accomplished. And in many cases, they've undermined issues that they set about to fix or, advance in some way. And in Jared's case, one of the things that he took on was peace in the Middle East.
Oh, my gosh,
that's
yes.
Easily soluble,
right.
monolithic problem, and ended up undermining some of existing U.S. efforts by shifting back and forth between the Qataris and Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit
to what
happened?
So you're absolutely right, Elizabeth. I mean, in fact, far from solving Middle East peace, he nearly put us into a war. So the narrative here, basically, is that, as you say, he just takes the Middle East portfolio right away from Rex Tillerson, who, Rex Tillerson's mistake was that he thought because he had the title Secretary of State, he actually had the job. But no, because Jared just literally takes it away. And then starts these meetings. I mean, when MBS, the future Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, first came to the White House, neither Rex Tillerson nor James Mattis, then the Secretary of Defense, were even there. So Jared appropriates this relationship, has these, as we know, these communications back and forth, and with WhatsApp, not just with MBS, he's also MBS's great mentor, MBZ, Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, as he's nicknamed. And you also have to remember that in the background there's the Kushner's old friend and advisor, Bibi Netanyahu. And Bibi Netanyahu's priorities have now shifted, because when President Obama signed the Iranian nuclear accord, basically Netanyahu, the Palestinian dispute was no longer Netanyahu's sort of chief priority. Now his chief priority was all about Iran. And it was Netanyahu who sort of thought it would be a great idea if America softened its relationship with Russia. Why? Because Netanyahu believed that in return, Putin would help get the Iranians out of Syria. Now, this is not something that any of the intelligence experts I spoke to agreed with, but it is very much something that Bibi sticks to. The other thing that happened was that this unusual alliance began, where the Israelis actually started sort of allying in some ways with Saudi Arabia and with the United Arab Emirates. So into all of this comes Jared Kushner, who's grown up sort of at the feet of Bibi Netanyahu. And Saudi Arabia is promising him money to finance his peace plan, but money for perhaps lots of other things as well. It's Jared who pushes for the first US official visit to Riyadh, to Saudi Arabia, not exactly a country with shared democratic values. Meanwhile, it's very complicated. Qatar is a much smaller country than Saudi Arabia, but it's much, much richer. On Saudi Arabia's border, it's in a complicated position. It houses an American airbase. That's our security in the area. But it's vulnerable because it's got sort of Saudi Arabia on one side and the ocean on the other. It happens to also share a gas field with Iran. It also houses Al Jazeera, which is hated by the theocracies in charge of Saudi Arabia, etc. So, but the Qataris have lots and lots and lots of money. Finance Minister of Qatar comes to New York, meets with Charles Kushner in 1st April of 2017. Charles Kushner asks him for around $1 billion to bail out 666 Fifth Avenue. And the Qataris turn him down just because it's a bad investment. I mean, this building, as I've said, may as well be dirt. Then the Saudi summit takes place, and the Qataris notice that they feel slighted by the Saudis at that summit. The emir arrives, he's cut off from his entourage. The summit is supposedly all about cooperation in the region, but the Qataris are not invited to the actual meeting on cooperation. Meanwhile, Jared and Ivanka go for a private, unmonitored meeting with MBS. So no one knows exactly what they talked about. But what experts do know is that MBS wanted money. The war in Yemen, brutal war in Yemen, had cost him a lot of money, and oil prices had fallen. 10 days after this summit, Rex Tillerson and General Mattis were in Australia at an annual gathering with all their international counterparts. They were absolutely horrified to discover that the Saudis and the Emiratis were leading a blockade of Qatar. They knew that this was about, MBS wanted to gain access to the Qatari resources. That's our airbase. That's our security on the line. And they also knew that the Saudis would never, ever have done this without a green light from the White House. They knew it wasn't from the president. The president didn't even know we had an airbase in Qatar. The green light had come from Jared Kushner. And it gets worse, because then Jared Kushner makes a another visit to the region, the Qataris actually were able to withstand the blockade. So MBS was not able to overthrow the regime and get money that way. So, Jared Kushner appears, they stay up all night. Again, all protocols broken with. No one in the State Department, no one national security has any idea, what they necessarily talked about. But days later, MBS rounds up 6 of the 7 ruling families in Saudi Arabia, imprisons them, and basically they have to sign over some of their wealth to him. Rex Tillerson said to Jared Kushner, Jared, have you noticed the only branch of the royals he didn't round up was his own blood relatives? Don't you think it's statistically unlikely that they're the only ones who are not corrupt? Jared did not want to know. But the interesting, the end of the story comes in 2018 when MBS comes to Washington and Trump asks him for more money. Says, I want, $4 billion to help rebuilding Syria. MBS drags his feet a bit. Then the Qataris arrive in town and say, well, we've got lots of money, but we've got a problem. We've got this blockade. Very interestingly, 2 things then happen within 2 weeks of each other. The US withdraws its support for the blockade. And a Canadian company called Brookfield, whose largest outside shareholder is the Qatar Investment Authority, announces it's in talks to bail out 666 Fifth Avenue. And the way they do the deal, if you ask anyone in real estate in New York, it stinks. They did, in the end, this company does a 99-year lease. They don't buy the building, they do a 99-year lease, ground lease, and the entire lease is paid up front. You don't have to know much about real estate or even be good at math to see that that doesn't make any sense. Publicly, Brookfield have said, we didn't talk to the Qataris. The Qataris have said we didn't talk to Brookfield, but nobody really believes that. And my own reporting, I think, since then tells me that the Qataris definitely felt pressured to do that deal. This is really dangerous stuff. This is Jared Kushner doing diplomacy in the dark, cutting out all the agencies who, the protocols that have been in place for decades to keep our country safe. There's a reason we're supposed to inform our embassies. There's a reason we're supposed to loop the National Security Council in when we talk to anybody. But Jared Kushner doesn't understand that because he doesn't come from a world like that. Even in the transition, Gary Cohn, the former president of Goldman Sachs, whose office was right next to Jared Kushner, was horrified when he kept noticing that Jared was never there. And he said to Avi Berkowitz, Jared's assistant, where is he? Because he knew that Trump wasn't with him, because he could see Trump interviewing candidates for the cabinet. And Avi Berkowitz said, well, I don't know. He said, the calendar, it's marked secret. And Gary Cohn said to Jared, Jared, you realize that everything you do from now on is discoverable. You've got, wherever you're going, you have to take a lawyer. You have to take somebody. You can't sort of just go off and freelance like this. But Jared did not. He doesn't come from a world where he thinks that these kinds of things are important.
Yeah. I think, it's funny. His relationship with MBS is something that gives even the most diehard Republicans pause.
Yeah.
And some of it is, when you see him cozying up to dictatorial regimes, it seems like it's a combination of naivete and just straight up nihilism.
Right.
He as you mentioned several times, he and Ivanka think that the rules don't apply to them.
Right.
How do you function? How do their colleagues function in that environment? What was the reaction?
Well, so it causes actually distress, understandably. I mean, you've got people who really went into that White House to put in a long hours, and who actually made quite a lot of sacrifices to do this. And then there they are, surrounded by two people who are, undercut them at every turn. I mean, Reince Priebus, I think one of the reasons that Reince Priebus sort of didn't squawk when the White House logs got closed, I mean, that was an outrage, right? The idea the American people should be able to see who goes in and out of the White House. It's why we have visitors logs. But he knew that the order to close them had actually not come from President Trump, it had come from Jared, because Jared was having all these networking meetings with people he shouldn't have. I mean, one of the people he was meeting with was Lloyd Blankfein, then the CEO of Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs was an investor in a company called Cadre that Jared had co-founded with his brother Josh. And not only had he not divested from it, he hadn't even put it on his disclosure form. So these are not the sorts, there's no way he should have been meeting with Lloyd Blankfein. Reince Priebus was aware, not necessarily of all those details, but of some of it. But he was so busy trying to create some sort of order that it was sort of it wasn't worth it to him to try and fight that battle.
I thought it was significant that you ended the book with the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, because that might be the apotheosis of damage that Jared personally has done during this administration, and you highlighted how callous he was about it. He viewed it as a PR obstacle to be overcome. Right. Was that surprising to you?
Well, by the time I got to the end of the book, nothing was surprising to me. No, and it's still going on, right? I mean, right now, as you and I are having this conversation, Congress, quite rightly, has demanded to know what actually Jared talked about with MBS when he went to visit last February. I mean, just this February. I mean, yet again, there you have these secret meetings, more of these communications via WhatsApp, and Jared sort of dismissing, laughing about concerns about his security clearance, and saying it's a rough region. I mean, you see again this sort of moral expediency that his father had. Setting up my brother-in-law with a prostitute, filming it. That's not, why is the law involved in that? Why is that a crime? And here, again, you see the son sort of, not worried about his methodology. I mean, I think it's really, really troubling.
Yeah. Your overall portrait of them is that, their behavior in Washington has been characterized by their arrogance, their incompetence on the issues, their unwillingness to learn. How do you think they view themselves that way? Do you think they believe that their tenure so far has been successful?
So, I mean, I think what's quite sort of clear is that they don't view themselves or the world the way other people do. I mean, it might even have been you. Somebody mentioned the reality distortion field in that certainly Jared has, Ivanka has it too. I do think that, now that the Democrats have control of the House and they have subpoena power, and now that there is all this focus on the security clearances, and now it's sort of become clear that Ivanka boldly went on television and just flat out lied, about the fact that there was nothing unusual in the way she got her security clearance. I think that they would have to notice that their messaging is perhaps, falling on deaf ears. I say in the book that Ivanka has presidential aspirations, but I also do wonder who she thinks her base is.
Yeah, you mentioned a source saying that her own brothers wouldn't vote for her.
Yes, I mean, and it is interesting, right? Because where is she politically? I mean, she hasn't cast herself really as a Republican, but at this point, the Democrats are so repulsed by the ethics issues, by the entitlement. It's going. I mean, I think we're at a crossroads. I mean, this is really how I end the book. They have so far, they are the survivors. I mean, look at the body count around them in this White House. It's extremely high, and they are still there. Will they be held to account? Will Donald Trump, this is the other really interesting dynamic, will they at some point become too much of an obstacle for him that he just has to let them go? I mean, he goes back and forth on this. He was furious with them over when they misused emails, because that's what he'd gone after Hillary Clinton with. And that caused him to say to John Kelly, can you just get rid of them? Make life so pleasant that they don't want to work here. But then, of course, the irony is it's Trump, president, who can't pull the trigger on his own daughter. And then he seems to forget about it. But I think that if, he's very unexcited about all the focus and that there is on the Kushner company's finances. And because that leads to an exploration of his finances. So there is a scenario in which he says, this is going to be bad for me politically. So, or not. I mean...
Well, you've covered powerful people and power elites for the entirety of your career, and many of the people who were social with Ivanka and Jared in New York, people who worked with them in real estate, even outside of your reporting on this book. What happens if they come back to New York, of their own volition or not? How are people going to react to them?
So, it's a really interesting question. There are a lot of people who won't want to have anything to do with them. Absolutely. I suspect, I know that unfortunately there is a small kernel of people sort of like them, very, very rich, slightly ignorant, blind and careless. And it's like the line about the Buchanans at the end of The Great Gatsby. Rich, careless people who don't really have a grasp of the extraordinary dangers they kind of pose to us. I suspect that group will embrace them, but that's it.
Yeah, it's interesting. At the beginning of their tenure, people would contrast them a lot with Steve Bannon and the sort of Bannon-style populism that got Trump elected in the first place, and it was described by somebody, either Bannon or somebody close to Bannon, as believing that the government was bad because it imposed unnecessary restraints on their schemes to make money.
Right.
And I thought that was, a really great metaphor for what had happened when Jared and Ivanka went to Washington. Do you think that net, their tenure there has been worth it for them?
It depends on whose framework you're assessing that by. Do I think that Jared has, in the short term, made money? The Kushner family has made money. It seems clear that they have. But whether or not that will cost them in the long term is really, I think, the question that the book poses.
Yeah. Another thing that you highlight throughout the book is how gratuitously they've alienated a lot of people. And you specifically talked about Michael Cohen, who ostensibly wanted a job in the White House, and Jared and Ivanka were instrumental in ensuring that he didn't get one, and that blew up in their faces. Can you think of other examples where they, either because of a need for control or just feeling like, they felt entitled to make these decisions?
Well, I think what's interesting actually about the Michael Cohen thing is that what was interesting to me as a reporter was how people of completely different ideologies would come together and agree about Jared and Ivanka. So, for example, Gary Cohn, who's a Democrat, and Steve Bannon, obviously, is Steve Bannon, would both have agreed that for Jared and Ivanka to alienate Michael Cohen was they thought stupid, because it would be much better to keep him in the tent. And I think what in some ways surprised me in the reporting of this book, well, I wasn't expecting that both sides of the political aisle would actually come together and agree so much about these two. I mean, that was very surprising.
You also end the book on a bit of a cliffhanger. You mentioned that one of your most important sources said, when they're gone from the White House, I'll tell you the real story.
Yes. So there are, well, you just have to think, Elizabeth, of the people who we haven't heard publicly from yet, but we know they have lots. We know, for example, that John Kelly and Don McCann, the ones who thought that they needed to write a memo to the file about the security clearances, that the very fact that they did that means that they really felt something was amiss. Yeah. They've not really talked publicly. Rex Tillerson has not talked publicly. There is a lot more to be said, and it's all in the details.
Is there any one person who you didn't talk to for the book, or wasn't accessible to you, that you feel like you'd still like to hear from?
Oh yes, but I'm not going to probably throw that out there. Might ruin all chances I've got. But but what I did, I felt that I really did, I did cover a lot of ground, and I mean precisely because between the two of them, they really meddle in everything. I mean, he's called the secretary of everything. There was an enormous amount of territory. I was in Mexico, China, Russia, Israel. I mean, it was a lot to get my arms around.
So is there going to be a sequel?
Probably. Probably.
Well, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
This program is available as a podcast. All Afterwards programs can be viewed on our